Okay, so we're back again on our speed run. Again, we're going for the Pirc defense here with the move pawn to d6. Knight f3, we're going to play the move knight to f6. And after the move knight c3, again we go to move pawn to g6, developing our bishop to the g7 square. So generally this is not a very dangerous setup for black, unless white goes for one, bishop to e3, queen to d2 to try and attack our king, or goes for some sort of pawn march with f4. So instead, white has gone for an immediate push in the center with the move pawn to e5, and this is a very common response at this level to attack the knight to gain some time. Now, it does look dangerous at first, but then you realize this pawn on e5 can actually become a problem later on. For example, we can actually capture this pawn and then offer an exchange of queens. We can also maybe retreat our knight to d7. So knight to d7 and then maybe reroute our knight to b6. That would also be perfectly fine. But in this position, I'm just going to capture. Now, I'm not worried about a queen trade. Now, after knight takes, I'm just going to castle the king to safety. And again, the move bishop to c4. So now we should look to put some pressure on white's center, because this knight on e5 is relatively strong piece. Now we can play the move pawn to c5 to try and challenge this pawn in the center and maybe win it back with a typical idea of playing queen to c7, maybe attacking the knight and also attacking this pawn on c5. So that would be one way to play. Another way to play might be to just develop the knight to d7. They're both very good. I could also just play c6, a very solid move in this position. Here I'm just going to play the move knight to d7 because I want to highlight a common mistake which I think my opponent is most likely going to play. And after knight d7, I think they'll take on f7 and give up the two pieces for the rook. And this is a mistake I find that a lot of players make, especially at this level, because they don't value the two pieces. So knight takes f7 here would be a mistake. It looks very enticing and all because the bishop is pinning the rook, but sooner or later, once the exchanges happen, the pieces will eventually sort of be better than the rook. Now, if white doesn't go for knight takes f7, then we might just capture the knight. We might also play knight to b6 to attack this bishop. Okay, so white doesn't go for knight takes f7. So in this position, we can just capture this knight, and the e5 pawn can be a little bit weak. We can also go knight to b6 here to attack the bishop. So I'm going to go knight to b6 here to attack the bishop. So the bishop should stand this diagonal with the move bishop to b3. Yep. And after that, I think we should just play the move pawn to c6. So this is a very solid way of playing. We're just controlling this square on d5. And then later on, we're going to move our bishop, develop it perhaps to f5. And sometimes we can maybe swing a piece into the d5 square here. Okay, rook to e1. So white's playing some very solid moves so far, hasn't really made any mistakes. So I want to get rid of this knight at some point as well. This would be one of our main goals. So we could play the move knight to d5 here and maybe look at playing the move pawn to f6. That's a possible way of getting rid of the knight. We could also maybe challenge the knight, but then again we'll probably have to take the knight at some point. Queen c7 is no good in this position because bishop f4. I could offer some exchange of pieces. Could also just play the move bishop to f5, develop a piece. Then just play bishop f5. I'm just going to develop a piece. It might run into the move pawn to g4 in this position, but I think it does weaken white's position a little bit as well. So if g4 comes, then I'll just move my bishop back. So bishop g5 is a very good move. So our opponent is playing some very, very strong moves this game so far. Just developing pieces, doing everything right. So our pieces are also fully developed, but white's pieces are definitely a little bit more active than ours. So we can go queen c7 here to try and put pressure on this d pawn. So now our goal is to play rook to d8 to really put pressure on this open d file. So whenever you get a semi-open file, try to make use of it by putting your rooks towards that file. Also, we can put pressure on this pawn later on by playing the move pawn to c5. Okay, bishop takes f6. So this is definitely the first mistake of the game from white. Before here, white hasn't made any mistakes. And this mistake, I think, is a very common one. As I mentioned, it's giving up the bishop pair way too early, especially this dark squared bishop. So here we can take with the bishop, but I'm just going to take with the pawn to get rid of this knight. Now, sometimes doubling your pawns isn't necessarily a bad thing. In this position, we're doubling our own pawns, but we're going to win an important tempo, and we're also going to be chasing away this knight on e5, which is a very annoying piece for us. Also, we open up the queen towards the defense of this f7 pawn in case we need it later on. But more importantly, this tempo by attacking this knight is going to be very valuable for us. So especially at this level, don't give up your bishop so early. But that goes for every level. You'll see me stress that. So our bishop is temporarily blocked, but we can probably bring it into the game later on. So I'm thinking of actually just moving my bishop back all the way to c8 and then playing f5 to open up an attack on this pawn. I can also play the move queen to d6, which creates a double attack on the pawn here, as well as the knight here on b4. So that's another move here, queen to d6. That's actually a very strong move, attacking two things at the same time. I also have this move pawn to a5. Now, after pawn to a5, the knight doesn't have too many squares to go to. Actually, after the move pawn to a5, the knight has to go back to d3. It's the only square. And after knight to d3, I now can capture the pawn on d4 because it will be blocking the defense from the queen. So I always want to look for pieces which don't have too many squares to go to and try to target those pieces. Here the knight has no squares. Also moves which gain tempo is going to be very, very important. We could have also played c5, but c5 I didn't like as much because it allowed this knight to jump into the d5 square. So I liked much more this move, pawn to a5. Okay, so white has just sacrificed the knight. So there was no need to sacrifice that knight. The knight could perfectly just go back. I can take with the queen. I can also take with the pawn. I'm going to take with the pawn just because I don't want to allow white to get this passed pawn. If I take with the queen, then this would be a passed pawn. So there's definitely a little bit of panic there. Didn't need to sacrifice the knight at all. So now we can go c5 next move and try to put pressure on this central d pawn and open file. Yep. So you always want to be looking at ways to attack the pinned piece. So here it would be the pinned pawn. So we're applying more pressure to the pin by playing the move pawn to c5. Very strong move. After the move pawn to d5, I believe we can play the move pawn to c4. And the piece is very short on squares, that bishop. I sort of want to trap it completely and play bishop to d7 first. Okay, I'm going to play bishop to d7 first to try and threaten to trap this bishop with a4 c4. I don't need to play this move, but just want to see if white's going to see the threat or not. Also, we can open up our bishop with the move pawn to f5. Okay, so white spots the threat. We retreat our queen back because it's being attacked by the pawn. We still continue to threaten c4 and trapping the bishop. Okay, so c4 traps the bishop. And yeah, that's a free piece because it's undefended. I'm going to take with the knight just because I want to keep my bishops. If queen takes pawn here, I have queen takes pawn on, or bishop takes pawn on c2. After that move, I think I can just exchange and then drop the bishop back to c6. Okay, so now I think I just captured the pawn. So that's a very important passed pawn. So once we get rid of this, it's very hard for white to win the game or have any winning chances. Now he only has these two connected passed pawns on the queen side, but we have two extra bishops, so it is not enough here for white at all. I'm just going to go for a bishop and queen battery and then go for a checkmate on g2. So bring the bishop all the way back and play queen to b7 next. You go queen to b7. It's like a one move threat, which our opponent is probably going to spot. But if you can set up threats, so this goes for any level, but especially at beginner to intermediate level, the more threats you set up, the more chance that your opponent is going to fall into one of those threats and blunder. So for example, again, we get the rook to the 7th rank, and I'm setting up a threat of actually a rook sacrifice now. Rook takes g2, king takes, and I'm going to take this pawn on f3 and have a checkmating battery. And yes, this is just more likelihood that our opponent is going to make a mistake. So here our opponent goes rook to c7, but this allows us to play the move rook takes g2 check, and then queen takes f3 followed by our mate. Okay, so 96.2% accuracy. Okay, so we have a normal Pirc, and here our opponent plays the move pawn to e5. So after e5, we capture the pawn. We can also perhaps move the knight, which is another common way of playing, and then we sort of put pressure on this pawn by retreating. But I think here we can just take, if white captures, then we can just take the queen. This would be perfectly fine to take the queen, and after queen takes queen, the idea is that if the knight captures, then the knight is no longer on c3, so we don't have to worry about any more knight d5s or knight to b5 type of moves coming anymore. And also after the move knight to g4, it's very hard for white to attack this pawn. So for example, defend this pawn. So after bishop f4, we could follow through with knight to c6 perhaps, and we're putting more pressure on this pawn on e5. Eventually the pawn is probably going to drop. So for example, let's say bishop here, we go bishop to d7, again renewing the threat on the pawn. White takes, we take back, now we're attacking the knight, which is a defender of the pawn on e5, and eventually we will be able to capture on e5. Now if king takes, same thing, after knight g4 it's probably worse, because now we're attacking this pawn on f2 as well as e5. So knight takes was a very good move, and bishop c4, always look to bring your pieces out to the most active squares. In this position, knight e5, bishop c4 was the best square for white. Now after knight d7, I was tempting black into playing, white into playing this, and going for this type of position, which is something you definitely should try to avoid, especially in the early game, because most often than not, giving up two pieces for a rook is, even if you get a pawn for it, is not enough. If you get two pawns for it, then maybe it's okay. But our opponent didn't do this, went for another move. So in this position, yeah, we could have also gone c5. c5 is probably the best move to put immediate pressure on the center. And I went for knight b6, which is definitely a much slower way of playing it. So definitely you can consider c5, putting pressure on the center, probably a better move. Here after move rook to e1, bishop to f5, bishop to g5. Actually white has been playing like excellent moves so far. And after queen c7, the only mistake so far in my eyes is the move bishop takes on f6, because after bishop takes f6 I take back with the pawn. So we win this tempo by attacking the knight, and then the d4 pawn is extremely weak. So now after the move knight to b4, yeah, we just play the move pawn to a5, and now the knight basically has no squares to go to. If it goes back here, then rook takes d4 is very strong, picks up a pawn, and now we just put more pressure, and we're already significantly material up, and then we pick up another piece as well. And then here we just remove the most dangerous threat. So I've seen people lose such positions because they don't remove like a very dangerous passed pawns, such as this one. They just leave it on the board, and somehow they're able to find a way to lose. So if you just remove any possible chance that your opponent has of beating you, then it's less likely that you'll get into these situations where something bad could go wrong. And here we set up the threat of this battery with the move rook to d2, and then we get a nice checkmate at the end. So I hope you enjoyed this game. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all on the next speedrun game.